Today's discussion aims to provide context and expert perspectives of corporate responses to the renewed and vigorous conversations about racial injustice in America. I'm pleased to introduce today Amy Smith, who is the Managing Director of Deloitte's Government and Public Services Practice, and also the Talent and Inclusion Leader at her company. India Gary Martin, who is a 25-year financial services veteran who's held numerous positions in global C-suites and is a gender and race equity practitioner, as well as a Forbes Coaches Council member. And also Rory Verrett, who is the founder and managing partner of Protege Search, a executive search firm focused on diverse talent and public affairs. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Amy Smith.
Good afternoon, and I suppose good morning to anyone who's joining us from the West Coast. Thank you, Mary Beth, for that intro. And I would just say, as you acknowledged, the history of racism and violence in society is not new. However, the current conversation and national attention on this issue is new. And within Deloitte, we're talking about how this will not be an easy or quick solution, and we have to balance passion around short-term gains with also being committed to a longer-term strategy that is sustainable over time. We want to make sure that we are emphasizing internally that we've had a long-standing history of leading in inclusion, and our commitment to inclusion is embedded throughout the entire organization. It's for everyone, by everyone. So in my mind, while my ability to talk about things that weren't necessarily part of the conversation for a long time, we now have my other partners and my professionals using words like white supremacy and anti-racism in open, firm dialogue, which is exciting and new. But the business case remains the same. There's always been a robust business case for making sure that we had equity, diversity, and inclusion in the firm, and we remain committed to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. So as someone who spent many years in the corporate sector and is now kind of out working with the corporate sector to try to work through these issues, it's really interesting because, DE&I functions D&I, because the E is fairly recent for a lot of organizations, but D&I functions in their current iteration kind of came about in, the late 90s. It's kind of when every organization decided they were going to do D&I functions. And the reality is that, yes, D&I existed, and there were the 5 pillars, which were started off and kind of in the beginning with gender, race, disability, age, and then LGBTQ plus now, but at the time LGBT. And the reality is that it's always been about women, right? It's the easiest thing to tackle. And while organizations have always said, the ones that I've been in and the ones that I work with have always said, we're about D&I, what that really means is we've been about women and about progressing the issues that face women in the workplace, because pretty much the other groups with varying levels of success have had some attention or not, but race has been the challenging one. And so now we're having conversations about race. And they're hard conversations because, race and racism is kind of woven into the very fabric of our society. And if we couldn't have those conversations societally, then it would certainly be challenging to have those conversations in the microcosm that's organizations. And so, yes, I mean, we're having the conversations, but they're hard. And, for me, in my experience anyway, and what I've kind of, having been in this space over 20 years, it's the business case is important, but it's not about the business case. It's about humanity. It's about people. It's about getting it right. It's about starting to address the inequity in systems, right? We are spending a lot of time talking about people and race and racism, and that's important. But what's more important is the systems. People exist inside of systems. And so if we want to talk about meaningful change, that's only going to happen because we start to think about systems.
And Rory?
Yeah, I would say that this moment offers an opportunity to really change the narrative, to have a game-changing narrative about diversity and inclusion in corporate America. And if we don't change the narrative, if we don't change the topics that we talk about, if we don't change the vocabulary, it'll be a wasted scenario. Corporate America went through this when Barack Obama was president. I remember I was in search and all of a sudden corporate America discovered it might be interesting to hire Black people now. We've got a Black president. And so one of my busiest years in search was 2009, when every trade association wanted to hire Black lobbyists. So one of the things we have to do, I think, in the conversations I'm having with our clients that are from tech, financial services, private equity, is that we have to sort of address some of the taboo sacred cow topics that have existed in diversity and inclusion for years. And India highlighted one of them. One of them is this notion that corporate America is a meritocracy. That is a flat out lie. It is not a meritocracy. If it were a meritocracy, it would not be majority white. People hire adjacent, proximate talent, full stop. You read any biography of any startup CEO, Mark Zuckerberg in Facebook did not go and look for the best engineering talent. He knocked on dorm room doors in his dorm to find people. They coded the wrong language. He still hired them. He didn't go to MIT or go to Howard and try to find Black engineering talent. He went next door. Whoever was next door at Harvard, humanities major, coding talent, correct or not, was hired. That happens a lot in corporate America. So we got to break down the notion, the sacred cow, that corporate America is a meritocracy. There is uneven sponsorship. There is bias in promotion. There is bias in hiring. There is bias in who gets stretch assignments. There's benefit of the doubt, unequally distributed in the organization. I was the head of talent at the NFL. I've been in this business for 30 years. To say it's a meritocracy and to begin with that is a lie. So I hope we kind of break through that. The second one is that diversity represents it's not a zero-sum game. It is a zero-sum game. It is a zero-sum game. We have to approach this not like this is some kumbaya moment. This is a redistribution of income and wealth. If you make somebody a product manager at Google, you instantly make them a millionaire. If your company, for example, is using a referral system for referring who gets jobs and your company itself is majority white, you are already embedding into that process that people are going to refer who they have in their networks. And given the wealth creation opportunities in these sectors, they are going to determine, as part of a bias, who they feel is worthy of a vesting cycle that can make them multi-millionaires. So we got to stop saying that this rising tide lifts all boats. It doesn't. You hire somebody Black, somebody white is not getting that job. You hire a woman, a man is not getting that job. We have to stop saying it's not a zero-sum game. It is a zero-sum game. And thirdly, I think India highlighted this. If the business case for diversity were that strong, all of these businesses that seem to be very successful doing business would in fact have adopted diversity, but they haven't. And so those of us who are practitioners, we've sort of lost the narrative about the movement, and we've ceded it to the business community that they would define this on their own terms. And the last 20 or 30 years has shown that that is an abject failure. When business defines it, nothing gets done. Silicon Valley is moving on diversity because Rainbow pushed them on diversity. Right now, corporate America is seeing the light. Why? Because Black men and women were murdered on videotape. They didn't come to see a light. They didn't read the last McKinsey article. They didn't, have some finally take the advice of their great diversity and inclusion leader. Black people were murdered, and they decided, okay, we'll change. So the business case has never really moved the needle. Social upheaval and pressure moves the needle. And so I hope in this moment, we just deal with some truth telling and take apart some of these sacred cow notions that are really not servicing us anymore.
Thank you, Rory. I think we have to provide some space to have those conversations, right? And I hear you loud and clear about when business is defining it, it's not necessarily achieving the same goals. So as we have experts who work with corporate clients, I'm just curious, India, where should they start? What do you think companies should try to achieve with their program, and what process do you think? Well, I don't tend to like that word. Let me strike that. And what should executive leadership follow to make sure that they're moving on those goals?
Okay, so the first thing is, and I start here with every single person I have this conversation with, is that you have to do your work before you can do the work. So, it was this interesting thing around, when the George Floyd murder happened, everybody had a statement and everybody was rushing out, right? And there's a really interesting juxtaposition between the change curve that organizations go through and the grief curve that people are on. Right. And so organizations rushed to, action, which is what they do. Right. Here's the problem. This is what we think we're going to do to solve it. So let's start doing some action. And people were in a very different place. So I do these sessions with organizations, and I will tell you that 65 to 75% of people are on the left side of the grief curve, which means that they are finding it difficult to operate. Yes, people come to work and do what they have to do, but it starts with understanding that people are in pain and there's a lot of trauma and grief that's happening. And that if you start rushing to action before you address the issues that people face and how they're feeling, then you're kind of building a house on sand. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, it's a process. Like moving to what the new DE&I model should look like is absolutely a process. And it starts with asking people who are experiencing in the organizations what they want. Too often, leaders decide what it's going to be without checking with the people about what they want and what they need, right? So it's first about doing the listening. Understand what people want. Don't rush to talk about what you're going to do. How about understand what people think they need first? That's number one. Number two, education. And that is around ensuring that people understand the collective history that we have. There is one part of history that's shared. We have one American history, which is actually not collective American history. And that is not, people aren't learning what they need to know to actually be able to operate in this space. So a part of it is education around history. It's the identity work, which I talked about, doing your work before the work. And then it's about how you embed the change in the organization. And again, not creating these kind of senior diversity councils. Diversity councils should be people of all levels of the organization, because you miss the mark when you have, again, leaders who aren't experiencing anymore what people in the organization experience, making decisions about what the organization should look like. And then last, because I could go on for a long time, is about kind of what Rory talked about in terms of starting to address systems, right? Looking at systems, because here's the trick, right? So you have a corporation, and people are in it, and it's been the same way for decades and decades and decades. People come and go, but the results are still the same. That lets you know that it's not about the people, it's about the systems and the process. The systems are built to, and again, outdated systems of thinking, and people build processes around what they know, right? And what people know is what we've had our entire lives to date. And if that's going to be different, then we have to kind of turn what we know on our head and start asking different questions.
And so you mentioned that part of it is making sure that it's what the people, what the employees want to, right? Getting their buy-in is critical to making sure that this is a successful endeavor. Is there any specific recommendation that you have as to how you listen and make sure you build that kind of groundswell of support for the program, and kind of although also an oversight component with those employees as well, that they are able to see the results?
Absolutely. So transparency is a huge part of that, obviously. So I'm not saying that that leaders don't have a role in this. They absolutely do. And they're being vocal about what this really is, and acknowledging that they don't have all the answers, and that it's going to require all of us to kind of shape what this looks like is a big part of that. But in terms of actionable things that folks can do, so in intersections, which is the racial equity practice that I work with, one of the things that we do is create core teams, for example. And those core teams are comprised of 30 or 35 people in an organization who essentially help to shape what the structure and strategy around racial equity in an organization will be. And again, that is from the security guard through to the CEO. So folks sit at different levels of organization who participate in those core teams. And so what you get is the diversity of thought, right? Which is what you're missing when you have only leaders making those decisions. And so, I really have this thing about, like, again, diversity councils and what that represents, because it actually doesn't represent people. It represents the leadership and what they think diversity looks like. So I'd say that kind of a starting point to answer your question is creating those core team or teams of people who then identify the kinds of issues in the system, because they can. We've seen folks do it. It always ends up, there are 4 or 5 things that always come out, and it's always about hiring. It's always about retention. It's all, it's always about representation, not seeing people who look like me. So therefore I have no path. Those kind of things emerge. But when you give voice to the people who are experiencing it, to actually help shape the solution, it's magic. It really transforms organizations.
That's an interesting point. And Amy, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit to talk about your experience. You're managing nearly, or maybe a little bit over 13,000 people across the country, and you guys have been at this for a little bit. Can you share some of your insights based on kind of India's comments?
Yeah, I agree with India that it can't just be top down. I do think that you have to get leadership aligned. Like, we've had grassroots movements in our practice before that were not successful because leadership didn't care. They weren't bought into the mission. It wasn't a priority. So to me, it's about driving things bottoms up, but also tops down. Within our practice, I lead the government and public services practice from an inclusion standpoint. We have spent the last year trying to create accessible conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. And we've had great success in adoption of those. So when I put the materials in the hands of my fellow partners, the adoption rate is not what I would want it to be because, to Rory's point, a lot of those people are white. They're not comfortable having conversations around race. They're not comfortable with the things that our practitioners who are coming off of campus are bringing in to the conversation, especially around systems of supremacy. But when I give those same materials to our analysts, our consultants, our senior consultants, I start to see a wave of change that is moving kind of across the whole thing. And people are getting excited about it. And we're starting to see more people enrolled, more people demanding change, which also is a good thing because it's not something that leaders can turn away from, right? If we care about the #1 talent experience in professional services, then we have to care about what our people are seeing. If you move outside of our GPS practice and you look at what Deloitte is doing, not just even in consulting, but across all of our businesses at what we call the green dot level, we basically are doing what India just described. We are standing a council up. It has majority professional level, so non-executives on it. We are talking about the things mentioned around equity representation. We're talking about how to be better allies because, the reality is that we aren't a majority people of color organization. And we have to, figure out how to get non-Black practitioners, non-people of color on board. I don't want to be an apologist, like I'm the only white woman. I'm sorry, Mary Beth, I don't know how you identify. I'm assuming based on the images that I'm the only white person on the panel. I'm middle-aged. I try every day not to be Karen, but I can't ignore the fact that every time I host a crucial conversation, there are people who aren't on board with what we're trying to do. And so I have to work very hard to figure out how to enroll them. And so, I think that I love it when people are passionate about it. We had Ijeoma Olu come in and speak. We had a great dialogue with her. And at the end of that, and she's spoken very publicly about D&I organizations are not the way to go. Leave those organizations and let's start our own, and our own being organizations started by people of color. But, I also don't want to abandon the idea that Deloitte could make a change or that we could help our clients make a change. And so I think with all of the other stuff around equity, inclusion, looking at diversity of our supply chain, how we spend our own money to run our own business, looking at our social impact, how do we balance capitalism with humanism? How do we justify making a profit in a world where doing business with any given client could end up, not being the best thing for us from a PR perspective? We have to get people to acknowledge that this is a system and we're all part of it. And I need to understand the role I play in that system. I need to understand the role that I play in racism. And we need to not let the majority voices, who are mostly non-POCs, disrupt the conversation we're trying to drive across the entire firm.
Thank you. And so, Rory, we have people that are tuned in that are on varying scales of their journey on diversity and inclusion. What do you think, or what key takeaways should they be thinking about as it relates to starting a program or feeling helpless and not sure where to start?
I would say apply an 80-20 rule. 80% of your time should be spent on processes and systems and 20% on sort of conversations. 80% of your time should be spent on changing the laws inside your organization or the rules, and 20% should be trying to change hearts and minds. Diversity has been in corporate America as a function for about 40 years. If we were going to change hearts and minds, we would have changed them in 40 years. I drive a sports car. There are speed limits around my neighborhood. I don't want to drive 35 miles per hour with my fancy new sports car. No one gave me a town hall meeting to tell me why I should drive 35 miles per hour with my fancy sports car. I just have to drive 35 miles per hour, okay? So, and when I go interstate, it gets to 65 miles an hour. No one gave me a seminar on why I should do that. When you have effective change, you first change policies and systems, and then you change hearts and minds. To be blunt, we cannot waste a generation of Black and brown talent waiting for white people to get woke on race. That is inefficient. It is unproductive. You have to basically start doing the following. Number one, tie compensation to diversity outcomes, not diversity intentions, diversity outcomes. How many people have you been promoted that are people of color? How many people did you put into senior leadership? How many people were on slates that you recruited? How many people of color were on the recruiting team that did the recruiting of those key roles? How much are you spending with minority suppliers? If you met, what gets measured gets done. Diversity is the only function that exists in corporate America where it is allowed to fail without any repercussion, despite the great efforts, by the way, of really hardworking, underappreciated diversity and inclusion executives. It is the only one. The CFO cannot say, well, we didn't find any money. Okay, try next year. The head of sales can't say, I didn't find any clients, right? But diversity is allowed to just incrementally fail year after year after year, and it's okay. So until you change the law, like in a society, until you change the laws, hearts and minds are not going to do it. I don't care if my coworker is racist. I don't care whether my coworker is a Trump supporter. I don't care if my coworker actually does microaggressions. What I care about is that if I work really hard in the company and I do what's right, that I would get promoted, that I'm paid the same as my Trump supporting racist neighbor in the next cube, that I'm promoted, that I have the same opportunity, that I'm reviewed fairly, that I'm mentored equally. Those are the things that matter. We could spend another 30 years moving hearts and minds, that's fine, but you're gonna waste a generation of talent. The last thing I'll say is, again, this whole thing about changing the narrative about diversity. We have to call non-diverse companies unethical companies. Full stop. It's not that, well, we try. You're an unethical company. You're an unethical company. And the ambitions of diversity have to be reframed. It is largely seen as blah, 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 compliance. That's what everybody hears. Blah, 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 compliance. It has to be, sports is the best metaphor for diversity and inclusion, right? If you look at any major sports league, women and men on each side of it, WNBA, NBA, LPGA Tour, PGA Tour, the more diverse they've become, the more commercially vibrant and relevant they have become. The PGA Tour had a whites only clause until 1961. When Black golfers were integrated in the 60s, they picked up their balls out of cups that had feces in it. Okay, what happened in around 1996? Somebody named Tiger Woods joined the tour. And now all these white players have higher purses. There's more sponsorship. It's a global game. And they are fighting to keep Tiger Woods as relevant for as long as he can, because here's the headline: the most commercially vibrant, viable model of the enterprise happened on the other side of your bias. So we got to stop making diversity about compliance and saying that's to me the business case. Is the NFL most vibrant, commercially viable when it's more diverse? The NBA, Major League, all of them, right? And so until we frame it in those terms, right, with those kind of ambitions, and then lay the laws and the process changes that will govern the organization beyond a charismatic diversity officer, beyond a woke CEO, beyond a social inflection point that stay in the organization, diversity will always have these fits and starts, and we'll just be waiting for another inflection point, to happen that can hopefully move the needle. But you gotta lay down the track of laws in these organizations, real hard process changes. If you don't do it now, you'll never do it.
Just to boil it down one step further. So if you had a recommendation on, like, let's say a particular law or policy that governs these organizations, corporate structure, firms, startups, whatever it might be, can you name a few that should be?
Sure.
Really, thank you.
Tie executive compensation to diversity outcomes. I guarantee you the people that don't give two hoots about diversity are going to figure out a way to achieve it, because newsflash, they're not joining your company to save the world. They're joining your company to make money. Cash rules everything around me. People are there. You have a bonus because you believe money incentivizes behavior. If you really care about behavior, about diversity, then tie it to executive compensation. Studies have shown that's what moves the needle, not a woke nature or I see the light, money. And the second thing is, when you tie it to compensation, measure it. Have actual goals in place in terms of the number of people we have to interview, the number of people we have to hire. This is all legal. No one's saying that you're going to violate Supreme Court jurisprudence on set-asides and quotas. You can have targets and you can hold your feet to the fire to those targets. I've been in organizations where I've seen, 30 people put up for a promotion who are all white. And I'm like, I'm sorry, you must have emailed me the wrong list. And then another list comes, that's better. I'm like, you still have the wrong email address. And then a third list comes, and apparently they get it right because they understand their compensation is tied to that. Okay, so I would do that. The other thing I would do is there are some very practical things you can do. I think it was India who talked about the bottoms up approach, or maybe it was Amy said the bottoms up approach. That's the top down stuff. That works. That's great. Some of the bottoms up stuff is research has shown, if you're dealing with millennials, for instance, you have a highly entrepreneurial sector of candidates and staff in your organization. And most companies are underutilizing that talent, right? They're underutilizing that talent. I had a chance to run the NFL's leadership development program. And over 2 years, we had 88 millennials, half of them women, half of them people of color. When given the chance to take the energy they are probably devoting to a side hustle because they're so disaffected at working at your company, when they took that energy and poured it into stretch projects and assignments, the thorny, intractable, strategic problems that senior leaders didn't have the time to solve, we devoted those people to solving those problems, magic happened, right? We got innovative, out of the box thinking. We got 10 people devoted to a critical strategic issue that changed the way these departments and functions and whole models of the league used. It was a marvelous program. And we didn't have to say it was a diversity program. They saw Jamal had that idea. Keisha came up with that process change. Benita had this new cost-saving measure, right? So find ways to give mobility and dynamism to your younger, diverse millennial talent, besides giving them the same lockstep in your organization. Break that model up and give them a chance to show and prove. You will likely retain them longer and prevent them from probably leaving to start their own company, which is the real threat now. Is not your competitor isn't the threat, their side hustle is the threat.
Thank you for that. And I think that's we always talk about it as the older generation is sucking up too many hours or too much comp, and that's a really good point for everyone to be mindful of, and certainly something that I'll take to heart when I'm thinking about my management role within Invariant. Amy, I have a question. So how are we supposed to make sure that these efforts are transformative? You know, no better than Deloitte to tell us about benchmarks and deliverables as it relates to this, since you all have a lot of expertise.
Yeah, I think that this making a change around diversity is in some ways making a change around anything, right? And change management isn't something that's new. I think one of the things we recommend and like to see with or see our clients think about is, in addition to some of the, I fully agree that you have to tie results around diversity, equity, inclusion to people's performance the same way you tie managed revenue and sales. I think it was India who talked about, maybe not loving the concept of councils, affinity groups, things like that. I agree. I think that makes diversity and inclusion not a priority. I think it makes it an extracurricular activity, and it becomes more of a social thing. That's something that people do on the side. So I think you have to, tie it to how your people are being measured from a quantitative perspective. But also from a qualitative perspective, I think you have to build it into what you expect from leadership capabilities. So, most organizations have some sort of talent framework, talent expectations framework that says, what people of different levels are supposed to be doing. I think you have to be able to articulate and add to that in terms of what people should be doing around diversity and inclusion as well. So it becomes just as much as I have to be able to manage the budget or a program schedule, I need to be able to be a leader who is willing to look at bias, who's willing to look at the makeup of my team. I need to be somebody who is competent in cultural intelligence. I need to be somebody who is creative and can think of new and different ways to kind of motivate my people and, motivate all people. So I would say, stopping treating it as a side project is really important, Mary Beth. I think the other thing people need to do is to make sure that, there's executive sponsorship. I think we've kind of hit that point, and so I don't want to drag it out, but it has to be all the way at the very top. Like if your top leaders are not talking about this topic and every time that they're addressing your practice or your employees, then people aren't going to be about it. I also think that you can't necessarily walk fully away from education. We all have work to do in terms of getting ourselves up to speed. So I think education has to be part of that plan. Not everybody comes to the table with the same set of knowledge, but Rory talked about kind of the spectrum between compliance all the way to like it being embedded into your culture. Education can't just be a check the box thing. So it can't be a compliance class that tells you not to touch somebody inappropriately. It can't be treated the same way as that. And then I think finally, accountability. This gets into tying, measures and metrics to people's compensation, but it also has to be tied to your overall corporate strategy, and you have to make sure you have measurable goals, not just for individuals, but for organizations within the broader organization. The goals should be reviewed. You have to make sure you're tracking progress. It should just be tracked like every other thing that people are focused on. People are going to do what is being measured.
I think that is a clear theme that is coming from this conversation, and I appreciate it. So we're going to turn to the question and answer period from some of the participants here. The first question, so how do you navigate talent acquisition goals, avoiding legal missteps to move the needle on diverse representation? I think, Rory, you want to kick that off?
Sure. This is also an area where you have to have this mixture of measurement and accountability, and then break down some of the taboo topics. So I'll leave it up to the legal experts and the review at a company level about whether your goals pass your own legal muster and whatever constitutional jurisprudence you want to be guided by. But I think there are certain things you can do that can improve the chances of you landing a diverse slate of candidates. First of all, it is to incorporate diversity earlier into the talent acquisition strategy, not the process, the strategy. What a lot of companies do is they'll say, well, we're going to mandate we have 1 or 2 diverse candidates on the slate. And that is inevitably going to be processed like this. They are the last people to be people will find, okay, the recruiter hears, I need 1 or 2 and you're expecting 6. So the first 4 will be white and the last 2 will be diverse, and I'll check that box. And what happens is, from even a psychological perspective, is the archetype sets in the first set of candidates, right? This person looks a certain way, has a certain background professionally, has a certain educational background, has a certain bearing and demeaning and mean. And the diverse candidate, no matter who they are, Indian, Black, woman, lesbian, they wind up being the other. And the research shows the other never gets the job. So you've got to, in some cases, harvest diverse talent, be introduced to diverse talent well before you need diverse talent, for no other reason than to try to disrupt what the archetype looks like. I recruited the CIO at the NFL, and the successful candidate was a woman. That is not necessarily what people thought the candidate would look like. That is what senior leadership gave me as a charge to say, you have free reign to find the best candidate. We really want to make sure we look at women leaders. So I'm not sure they were expecting a Southern, middle-aged white woman with a hard Southern accent who loved football in her bones. That's not who they expected the IT leader to be. They were either expecting an Asian, white, or Indian man, okay? But with the way we engineered the search, we made sure we put her earlier in the queue. So I could have had her interview last, had her interview first, because she was the most qualified candidate. And I knew everybody else was going to look less qualified than her. And whoever had a bias, if they did, would get over it because her qualifications were so sterling. If I put her last in the queue, she winds up just by archetype just being, yeah, she sounds good, but I'm really focused on Chad. Chad looks great because the archetype is set. That's one thing you can do. Number 2 is to diversify your interview team. We beg our clients to do this if they are not doing it. And I don't care if the person is a director and it's all EVPs and the director is Black, and they'll say, well, we don't want a token person. Well, here's what you got to do sometimes with diverse candidates. Somebody's moving to Rhode Island from Atlanta, and they love your company. They love the brand. They love the job. They just don't know how to get their life from Atlanta to Rhode Island. They don't know where they're getting their hair cut. They don't know where their wife is getting their hair done. They don't know if the Delta or Omega chapter is open and active in Rhode Island or not. They've got to, what I call, be recruited by their whole selves to this new market. It's something Silicon Valley, we are trying to get our clients to understand it, but en masse, they don't do well. They don't recruit the whole person. They say, we're Google. Of course you want to work here. For me to work at Google and you not help me understand how to make a life in the Bay Area means my child is going to a majority white school. I'm living in a majority white neighborhood. All the cultural elements that make my life meaningful, I'm abandoning. So the burden is on Google to offset all of that. And I'm sorry, free lunches and multicolored bikes don't offset that, okay? So there's some stuff you have to do in the recruiting process. Diversify your interview team, get diverse talent introduced earlier in the process, have real meaningful goals. I think the other practical thing I'll say lastly about what somebody diverse on the team can do on the interview team is help to interpret resumes in a way that might be missing. Bias may creep in, right? So there are a lot of people that went to HBCUs that turned down Stanford and Harvard because they wanted to go to a nicer social environment for Black people than Stanford or Harvard. And so when you see somebody from Xavier who is a STEM grad, and you see somebody from Caltech who's a STEM grad, and you apply a US News and World Report ranking, you might say the person at Caltech is clearly more qualified than the Xavier grad, not knowing that Xavier graduates more STEM grads than any Black school, than any school in America, right? And that people pick that pledging Alpha Phi Alpha at Morehouse is a credentialing and crucible of leadership filtering, the same way Skull and Bones or Fly might be at Harvard and Yale, right? So having somebody on the team that can interpret what resumes look like, this is what this means that this person did as an extracurricular, can really help equalize the set of experiences and value and worth that these diverse candidates are bringing.
Thanks, Roy. I appreciate that. I think that is one follow-up to that. If you're in a smaller environment and you are on the beginning of your process here on diversity, how do you get people to raise their hand and volunteer for these roles? Is it again a compensation issue, or nobody likes to be voluntold, right? So we're certainly putting a lot on our diverse employees this way.
Yeah, I think that if you position it as we're trying to improve outcomes with diverse talent, I think that, look, there's some people of color that will say, I don't want to do that. I don't trust the outreach you're giving me, probably, so I'm not doing it. I don't want to be a token. But if you make it of interest to them that we're trying to make it such that we have a critical mass of people, I'm guessing you may feel isolated in this organization by being one of 4. We're trying to make you one of 30. And this is the way we can do it. And this is a small part you can play. We find it meaningful for you to help educate us and help tell your experience about what it's like working here to this candidate that can really, really be meaningful. We have a critical lack of information. It's something I'm trying to solve for as an entrepreneur. We have a critical lack of information about the why when people of color leave organizations or don't accept offers, right? You just don't know. No, I don't want the offer. The recruiter doesn't say, well, why didn't you take the offer? And they don't always say, I couldn't find a way for myself to live in Oakland, or I don't want to move to the Bay Area. They say no. And you're so busy with recruiting, you just let it go. When your Black employees or brown employees leave, we don't ask the hard questions in the exit interview. Why are you leaving? I left a company and my boss said, we can't keep Black people here. Why did you leave? And I said, do you really want the answer to that question? He said, yes. I said, okay, you sure? I said, yeah. I said, all the Black people have Ivy League degrees and none of the white people have Ivy League degrees. So by some measure, it's like there's a Ivy League Dred Scott rule with Black people. Like we are 3/5 as qualified as a white person. So we got to have an overindulgent kind of career. I said, and so our colleagues on projects are Georgia State grads or University UT Knoxville grads. Not that that's a bad issue. They're not good people or smart people, but it seems to be all of the Black people have. I said, so you're over hiring for Black people. You're over hiring. Right? This is the least meritocratic environment we've been in. This is not like Harvard. This is not like Northwestern. This is not like Penn. Our peers we're not like these white folks we're working with, right? And so you need to disrupt the thinking that a Black person with those credentials is equal to a white person with these credentials. Like nobody but you believes that. The Black people don't believe that. So just and I think that was critical for them to understand. And he said, yeah, you're right. You're right. The Black person has to be a superhero. The white person just has to be a University of Georgia grad. And so that information, I encourage companies, ask the hard questions at your exit interviews. Ask your recruiters to find out why didn't they take the offer and probe deeply. We tell our clients, this is why they didn't take the offer. Somebody in the interview asked an inappropriate question. Nobody asked them about this part of their career or their lives, right? Because the mistake companies make is they think I'm being colorblind in my approach. I'm going to treat everyone the same. You can't treat everyone the same. Your Black and brown employees are not like your white employees. They typically have less career infrastructure, less information, less guidance, less mentoring. They are coming up the rough side of the mountain to arrive at the doorstep of your organization. If you treat them the same in how you recruit them, how you develop them, and how you advance them, it's going to fail. It's just going to fail.
Thank you for that. India, I had a question for you. How do you incorporate DEI within the work product an organization publicly publishes? So let's just say, how do you incorporate it into a federal policy proposal? How do you make sure that you're living that value in the work that you're writing and producing?
That's a very, very interesting question, and I think a difficult one. But I'll go back to a couple of things. The first one is that that it starts with you. Again, this is kind of you doing your work first, right, and understanding that what you, and this is for any of us, right, what we produce is based upon our own lens and experience. Right, there are some kind of baseline things that may shape that we all share, but your inevitable work product is about your own lens and experience, and so that's a big piece of this, right? And a big piece of this is picking apart your own lens and experience and seeing where your own biases might lie, right? And that whole conversation that we were having about kind of education and people needing to to learn whatever it might be. The reality is that again, most people don't know, right? They don't know, they don't understand their own biases because we've never had to, because we're operating in the way that it's always been, right? And so, for example, for Black people and people of color, we know what it is to navigate in a world that wasn't made for us, right? And so we operate through that lens. And so you're not going to hear people talking about the challenges that they face necessarily. We talk about it with each other, but won't talk about it with other people because it's just the way that it's always been, and we've had to navigate that. And regardless of the number of times you raise your voice, it still ends up being the same thing, right? And I can even say, even now, even though we're having this kind of racial reckoning, there are lots of folks who are wondering if this time is going to be different, right? And when the fatigue will set in and people will move on to the next news story. And I'm coming back to why you think about these things in your work product, right? Because guess what? As a Black person who is creating this work product, what you really want, and this goes to one of Rory's points, is folks who can be entrepreneurial and who think entrepreneurially. When people have restrictions, e.g., your livelihood is tied to your work, which is tied to your race, you're not getting the best work product out of that person because they are not going to push out and give you the kinds of ideas or the kinds of kind of reimagining, because it doesn't fit the mold that they know you expect. And we've seen what happens to people who don't, right? So I can tell you that in one organization that I worked in this organization, there were about 30,000 people. And when we had to go and when we were talking about, I had to collect all the data points for redundancies that we were doing, right? We got the list of redundancies, and 60% of the people on the list were either women or people of color. Completely not representative of the organization. The only reason that was challenged was because I was there. And I was like, wait a minute, I just did some quick metrics and I have a question. But had I not been there, what would have happened? And so kind of bringing that back to, your work product, a lot of this is about organizations creating the space for people, right? To be able to, and allowing people to come in their kind of wearing their full armor, stepping into the space. And we cannot. And people of color still cannot. And people still don't trust that that's going to be the case and that it's possible in the first instance. And one thing I will say, because I think it's important, again, as a part of this, is that speaking of people being able to step into spaces, when I was talking about not liking diversity councils, absolutely, I don't like that because it is people who sit at the top. I don't feel the same way about affinity groups. I want to make sure there's a real distinction about that, because affinity groups for people of color in a lot of these organizations equal safe spaces, which we would not have. And the same thing for the LGBTQ plus community, the same thing for women when we come and kind of have those. So I don't have an issue with affinity groups. And actually, they do create safe spaces if done properly and supported properly, where people who are marginalized and disenfranchised feel like they have a voice, and that there are people who are like them. Because sometimes you just need that just to get through. So back to the work product question, I would say that it is about understanding your own bias, but also acknowledging the limitations that you might face because it's tied to your livelihood, frankly, and what that means for organizations and the talent they're not getting because of that. I think Rory.
Can I piggyback on that? That was so brilliantly stated. I had a conversation with the CEO of a tech company, and he said, I want our company to be the leader, not only in tech, but I want it to be the leader in corporate America, who are my competitors with that level of ambition about diversity and inclusion? And I said, you don't really have one. I said, if you're looking at peers for who does this right, I said, you got to look outside of corporate America. I said, you know who does this right? Harvard does this right. Doesn't do it perfectly. Doesn't do it perfectly, but it does it right. I said, and I'll tell you as somebody who's had a lived experience as a stakeholder inside that institution. I went to an all-black, all-boys high school in Black New Orleans. I went to an all-black Howard in then Black DC. First time I'm around white folks en masse is Harvard. I go to Harvard, my mother calls me and says, how's your first week been at Harvard Law School? I said, it's been really great. There are some really smart white people up here. Because that's my first time being in this environment, right? And I tell my friends who went to Howard, I say, I love Harvard equally to Howard. And if you ever know anybody who's been to HBCU, it is like Wakanda. And people cannot understand that I would say that. They're like, really, Boston, Harvard, really? Harvard had 200 Black law students and 200 at the B school and 150 at the K school and 100 at the med school. I went to a small HBCU inside of the Harvard experience. To your point, India, I had an HBCU experience inside of Harvard. Okay, Harvard was not white boys in khakis sculling doing crew. It was ham hocks and greens and jazz music and hip hop and ciphers and Tribe Called Quest. That's what I think about when I think about Harvard, right? And companies have the ability to create these safe spaces inside the organization where you you squeeze every ounce of productivity and leadership out of your organization. Your Black and brown employees are coming to your door, okay, already with fairly low expectations set. There are low expectations. They know they're not going to the NAACP. They know they're going in majority organizations where they're going to suffer microaggressions, and they may have pay inequality, and they may get promoted at a slower rate than their white peers. Their expectations are low, okay? There is a little that can go a long way if you give them a safe space and give them some trust in the organization that you're going to treat them fairly. You will get an explosion of productivity and value out of them. The wonderful sort of side of this that we miss is that most people of color professionally, to India's point, are risk averse. It takes a lot for us to leave. It takes a lot. I mean, you get Black people in a room and tell them the worst stories they've had, it will blow your mind of what we have endured in corporate America, right? A little goes a long way, and a little incrementally sustained over a decade or two, you're gonna beat your competition. And that's what it's all about. It's beating it's being better at this than your competition, holding on to that amazing talent, getting access to those amazing markets, getting that entrepreneurial, innovative insight that you won't get from 7 white men at a table to add value to your bottom line, right? So there's enough out there to do it. This is a question of will. It's not of hearts and minds. It's will companies galvanize themselves at an enterprise level to really lay this track and do the hard work to actually make this a meaningful moment for change in corporate America. And I'm heartened by the 30 companies that have reached out to us in the last 25 days. That about 20 of them I think are game changers in how they're approaching this and what they want to do.
Thank you, Rory. And so to wrap things up, I just want to make sure that everyone can walk away with feeling like they left the conversation with something more than what they started with. And one question that I have, and I'll be selfish with the time, is numbers the holy grail here? I mean, is that it? Is that how this has to be changed? Is that the metric that is most important to follow? I know there are a lot of things that fall underneath it, but if that's the ultimate, I mean, just Amy, what's your sense here?
I mean, I think numbers are fine. I think that until there's representation, like the processes, like white supremacy will rule, right? So we want to make sure that we're bringing people in the door, but I also think you have to look at pay equity. You have to look at diversity of leadership roles. You have to look at what opportunities are Black practitioners getting. It's not just as simple as getting the people in, because I think what you might find is if if your recruiting engine is churning and it's doing all of the things that Rory talked about, but you're not paying any attention to breaking down the systems or looking at the talent experience, then it's just going to be a revolving door. And you're just going to be like bringing people in and they're going to be leaving at a rate and you're never going to be able to make gains. And so what you don't want is for the efforts to seem performative. And I worry that sometimes if you only focus on recruiting, that's what it's going to end up being.
Rory, do you have a perspective there?
Yeah, I think this moment, for instance, right now is sort of the Barack Obama moment of social movements. And again, I think numbers are important because Obama as a president was a great role model and it was inspirational, and that's all fine. But what will endure is the policy. What will endure are the appointments, right? And that's the infrastructure we got to lay right now. That will outlast. CEOs will come and go. I've seen diversity strategies wax and wane. When the woke CEO leaves and a conservative CEO comes in and says, I'm not doing that anymore, or a really dynamic diversity officer is sort of, helping the organization cheat by dint of their force of will, of personality and ingenuity. And then they leave and it waxes and wanes. The stage for leadership model and diversity and inclusion is when D&I is like technology. It is embedded in how they work and how the institution operates. So you have to start with laying this track, putting hard infrastructure down with numbers, and let the hearts and minds catch up. Still do your town hall, still do the critical conversations, but that is not the substitute for laying the track.
India, any last observations?
Yeah, I'll give a quick one. I agree with both of those things and the way that they were laid out, but I will say something about numbers specifically, and we could have a whole session on it, but it's about the reticence of human resources organizations to provide them to people, the transparency issue. And so, I will charge folks who are executives on this call, who are in leadership roles on this call, to ensure that, it's always about protectionism, right? We don't want to look bad. We can look around and see how many people there are. We can almost count them ourselves. So let's kind of put that to one side. And if we're talking about reimagining and challenging what this looks like, then we do need the numbers, because it is useful from a transparency perspective to understand our starting point and for everybody to understand that starting point. The deal is not, so people are going to be upset when they see the numbers, but they're more upset about the fact that you don't have a strategy, right? So if you can say, look, we know this is where we are. We're just transparent, but this is what we're going to do, then that's fine. It's one in absence of the other that's a problem. But I would say that we need to push and challenge very hard on HR organizations about their willingness to be to share what we need to know as a baseline.
Great. Well, we've come to the top of the hour, and I want to thank our panelists. You guys have done an amazing job of distilling about a semester's worth of work into an hour session in this virtual world. So we're very, very grateful for your perspective. And as I see it, the things that I'm going to take away today as a benefit from this conversation is that it starts with you. That companies need to create a safe space for their diverse population to create and talk about how they can take on different new assignments, stretch assignments, just be themselves. And that's still an important part of DEI. And then we need to change the laws and policies governing our organizations to have meaningful change. So that means we've got to roll up our sleeves, and we have a lot of work to do. And I think I'm just grateful for your work and your time today. And with that, I will say there's way more questions that were posed than we were able to answer. But we'll be emailing folks soon for our next panel conversation in this series of Dialogue for Change. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.